So in 410 AD, when the Visigoths finally sacked Rome, that event sent absolute shockwaves through the ancient world. But, the actual fall of the city wasn't some cinematic battle where a vastly superior force battered down the defenses.
Right. The gates of Rome were actually just opened from the inside by a starving and honestly completely disillusioned populace.
Exactly. And welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we've got a really fascinating stack of sources looking at one of the most haunting historical mysteries out there. Why do great civilizations, societies that seem completely invincible, why do they ultimately collapse?
And the sources we are unpacking today take a really cool multidisciplinary approach to that exact mystery. Rather than just, recounting dates and troop movements, they synthesize history, evolutionary theory, and even neuroscience to examine the underlying mechanics of a downfall.
Yeah, to really look under the hood. So the mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct those invisible internal forces that cause empires to crumble, and hopefully to help you spot the hidden patterns of decline before a crisis becomes glaringly obvious. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the core paradox we're looking at today is that civilizations don't usually collapse because of a sudden external force.
They really don't. They collapse because of quiet internal decay.
Which is wild to think about.
It completely flips the narrative we are typically taught. We tend to view history through the lens of sudden cataclysmic impacts. Like, a treaty is broken, an invasion happens, and the map changes overnight.
Right, but when you look at the sheer scale of what these historical societies achieved, it makes that internal decay even harder to wrap your head around. Take the ancient Egyptians during the Old Kingdom. They engineered colossal monuments that have literally outlasted millennia. Or the ancient Greek city-states, who were busy laying the absolute foundations for modern philosophy, math, democratic governance. And then, of course, you have the Romans constructing infrastructure, aqueducts, and legal frameworks that spanned entire continents.
And the citizens of those empires, they walked on paved roads, they drank clean water from sophisticated plumbing systems, and lived under the protection of just unmatched military logistics.
It must have felt untouchable.
Exactly. The psychological effect of living in that environment is a profound sense of permanence. They believed they had, effectively conquered the chaos of human history.
They felt they were the exception to the rule and that their dominance would just stretch on indefinitely. Yet today, every single one of those magnificent societies exists primarily in history books and museum exhibits.
Yeah.
Their cultural influence absolutely survives, but their actual empires are entirely gone. So what does this all mean for an entire society? Why does this specific pattern of rise and catastrophic fall repeat itself with such relentless consistency?
Well, the source material introduces a central metaphor to visualize this process, and I think it's brilliant. Imagine a magnificent ancient tree in the center of a dense forest.
Okay.
Above ground, this tree looks utterly invincible. Its trunk is massive, the branches stretch high above the canopy, the leaves are vibrant, and it produces abundant fruit. Any traveler walking past would assume it's going to stand for another 500 years.
Because every visible metric points to health and stability.
Right. But beneath the ground, completely hidden from view, the root system is deteriorating. The soil has been depleted of nutrients, the roots are slowly rotting, and the structural anchor of the tree is giving way.
Wow.
But from the outside, the daily routine of the forest continues. Birds still land in the branches, nothing seems amiss. Then a severe winter storm rolls in. The winds hit the canopy, and the massive tree violently crashes to the forest floor.
And the travelers walking past the next morning just look at the wreckage and blame the wind.
Exactly. They blame the external event. They assume the storm must have been unprecedented in its fury. What they miss is that the storm merely revealed a critical vulnerability that had been compounding in the dark for decades.
It's a great visual.
The wind didn't cure the tree, the hollowing roots did.
I really like that framing. But let's bring it out of the forest for a second. It reminds me of a nightmare scenario in real estate.
Oh, I know where this is going.
Right. Imagine you buy a pristine, beautiful house. The paint is fresh, the wainscoting is elegant, the roof looks brand new. You move your family in, assuming you've made the ultimate safe investment. But deep inside the walls, behind that flawless drywall, there is a massive, completely undetected termite infestation.
A silent killers.
Exactly. Those termites have been silently chewing through the foundational load-bearing beams for years. You go about your daily life completely oblivious until one day you lean against the living room wall and the entire structure just caves in around you.
Which is terrifying because you only experience the sudden catastrophic collapse. You never hear the slow, methodical chewing that made it inevitable.
Which brings us to the core of the issue. If we aren't talking about literal termites chewing through wood, what do the termites of a civilization actually look like? Like, what are the mechanisms of that internal rot?
So, the sources outline a very specific sequence of symptoms, starting with the erosion of long-term vision.
Okay, how so?
Well, as a society becomes incredibly wealthy and secure, the incentive structures fundamentally shift. The cultural focus moves from, what sacrifices do we need to make to build a better future a century from now, to how can we maximize our comfort and profit right this second.
Oh, man. So the mindset changes from planting an orchard for your grandchildren
Yeah.
to just clear-cutting whatever trees are currently standing so you can hit the quarterly earnings target.
That is a perfect way to put it. The political class realizes there is no immediate reward for long-term planning. And once that short-termism takes root, you see the second symptom, which is the gradual erosion of institutional trust.
Because the institutions start failing.
Right. As systems optimize for short-term gains, they often become bloated, bureaucratic, and detached from their original purpose. They stop delivering reliable results, and the public begins to view their own institutions with deep, deep cynicism.
And that cynicism inevitably bleeds into how the next generation is raised, right? The sources point out a fascinating, almost invisible shift in education during this phase.
It becomes one of the most critical turning points, honestly. The educational system stops teaching citizens how to ask difficult questions and instead reorganizes itself around forcing students to just memorize predetermined answers.
I would assume that happens because a society in decline becomes deeply insecure.
How do you mean?
Well, when your foundational beings are hollowed out by termites, the last thing the people in charge want is a generation of structural engineers coming in with flashlights and poking at the walls.
Oh, that's incredibly true.
Asking why becomes dangerous to the fragile status quo, so the culture just demands compliance instead.
And that demand for compliance completely reshapes the cognitive landscape of the society. When you lose the cultural habit of rigorous inquiry, it leads directly to the next symptom, the degradation of public debate. The public square doesn't get quieter. It actually gets much louder, much more aggressive, but significantly less thoughtful.
It turns into two sides, just screaming talking points past one another.
Yeah.
Neither is actually listening to understand the underlying mechanics of a problem.
The nuance is stripped away entirely, which culminates in the final symptom the sources identify. Evidence is consistently sidelined in favor of pure ideology.
Wow.
Genuine, open-minded curiosity, that willingness to say, hey, I don't know, let's find out, is replaced by an unshakable, absolute certainty. People adopt a tribal worldview, they decide they already possess all the answers, and they just stop looking for objective truth entirely.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because looking at that cascade of symptoms, short-termism, crumbling trust, rote memorization, thoughtless screaming, and ideological blindness, it begs a massive question. If all these structural cracks are forming, if the societal termites are chewing that loudly, why doesn't anyone sound the alarm? I mean, I'd normally assume this is just sociological groupthink or maybe state propaganda keeping people in the dark, but the sources actually point to our physical brain chemistry here, right?
Yes, this raises such an important question, and the neurological mechanism behind it is central to understanding the blindness. It all comes down to a region of the brain called the basal ganglia.
Okay.
Its primary function is to automate the familiar.
So it's like the brain's efficiency engine.
Exactly. It recognizes patterns in your environment and converts them into routines. Think about when you first learn to drive a car. It takes immense concentration.
Oh yeah, you're white-knuckling the steering wheel.
But after a few years, your basal ganglia takes over, and you can drive all the way home from work without consciously remembering the trip. The brain prunes those neural pathways to save energy.
Okay, so how does the brain's driving autopilot apply to the decline of an entire empire?
Because even as a society steadily decays, the basal ganglia continues to do its job of normalizing the environment. It takes the new, slightly more degraded, slightly more dysfunctional status quo, and it logs it as normal.
Just because it's familiar.
Right, because the overarching rhythm of daily life continues. Markets still open, people still commute, the sun still rises. So the brain actively filters out the slow compounding of institutional failure. The abnormal becomes completely routine.
Wow, so our own neurobiology is optimizing for efficiency, but in the process, it's tricking us into passively accepting a deteriorating baseline.
It is. Now, the brain does possess a countermeasure for this, which is the prefrontal cortex.
Ah.
This is the region responsible for complex analysis, critical thinking, deliberate self-reflection.
The heavy lifting.
The heavy lifting, exactly. The prefrontal cortex absolutely has the capacity to override the basal ganglia, observe the decay, and sound the alarm. But the source material emphasizes a crucial biological reality. Self-examination is neurologically expensive.
I read that part. It literally burns more calories. It takes a heavy toll on your glucose levels to constantly question your environment rather than just accepting it.
It requires immense cognitive effort to step outside your routine, challenge the prevailing narrative, and fundamentally question the reality you are living in. For most people, it is vastly easier, and honestly vastly less exhausting, to let the autopilot run and simply assume that tomorrow will operate exactly like yesterday.
I actually have an analogy for this that I think captures that physical feeling of exhaustion. It's exactly like developing terrible posture while sitting at a computer desk.
Oh, I love that.
Right. At first, you slouch a tiny bit, and your body might signal that it feels slightly off. But within a few days, your basal ganglia accepts that hunched posture as your new physiological baseline. It feels completely normal.
The surrounding muscles literally adapt to support the dysfunction.
Yes. And then, if someone tells you to sit up perfectly straight, to engage your core and align your spine, you have to consciously use your prefrontal cortex to command those muscles. And it feels incredibly uncomfortable.
It's a workout.
It is exhausting to hold that good posture. So because the effort is so expensive, you just let go and slump back down into the bad posture on autopilot. You keep doing that for years until eventually a disc slips and your back goes out entirely.
That is spot on. The physical cost of correction deters the action, just as the cognitive cost of civic correction deters societal change. And the sources take this biological reality and connect it directly to the concept of the blank slate in human evolution.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand the blank slate in this context.
Uh.
Does the text mean that we aren't born with some innate genetic instinct to maintain a republic or build an aqueduct?
Exactly.
So we don't inherit the operating manual for a healthy civilization in our DNA, meaning it has to be taught from scratch to every single newborn.
That is the absolute crux of the argument. Evolution dictates that species unable to adapt will go extinct, right? Because a thriving civilization is not genetically inherited, the behaviors that sustain it, or the behaviors that destroy it, must be learned.
Oh, wow.
A society literally learns the habits of decline. Generation after generation inherits a slightly weakened institutional foundation. They add their own small compromises to avoid the cognitive effort of fixing it, and they pass a worse baseline to their children.
So the slouching is cultural. It's passed down through failing institutions and through all those quiet, unquestioned assumptions that no one wants to spend the neurological energy to examine.
Yes.
But this brings me to a major point of pushback. Because if a society is just coasting on autopilot, slowly decaying from the inside out, something still has to finally break their backs.
Yeah.
If the rot is internal, what actually serves as the catalyst for the final collapse.
What's fascinating here is the distinction the text draws between a catalyst and a cause.
Yeah.
The profound danger to a civilization rarely comes from, the barbarian army massing at the border. Yeah, the real existential threat is the rigid, unexamined assumptions quietly compounding inside the minds of its citizens.
So the external threats, the wars, the plagues, the economic crashes, what role do they play if they aren't the root cause?
They are the storm hitting the forest. When a society undergoes a massive visible crisis, say a severe drought that ruins crop yields, a sudden economic depression that bankrupts the treasury, or a long draining border war, those events apply intense stress to the system.
Right.
But they do not invent the structural weakness. They simply expose the rot that the basal ganglia had been ignoring for decades. The visible crisis is merely the final chapter in the civilization's story. It's the moment the termite-hollowed wall finally gives way under the weight of a person leaning on it.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. I mean, couldn't a massive, completely unforeseen external shock just wipe out a perfectly healthy civilization?
Like what?
Think of the Black Death sweeping through Europe, or a sudden invasion by an overwhelmingly advanced technological force. Why do the sources insist that external events are almost always secondary to the internal decay? Couldn't the wind just be strong enough to knock over a perfectly healthy tree?
It's a really critical distinction to make, and it revolves entirely around the concept of resilience. A massive external shock will unequivocally cause immense damage, suffering, and disruption to any society, regardless of its health.
Right.
However, history demonstrates that how a society responds to that catastrophic shock is dictated by its internal integrity.
Okay. The Black Death is actually a perfect example of that. It killed a massive percentage of the European population, causing unimaginable trauma. But European civilization didn't collapse into dust. It eventually adapted, reorganized its labor structures, and paved the way for the Renaissance.
Exactly. The internal resilience determines the ultimate outcome. A healthy, robust tree might lose several large branches in a Category 5 hurricane, but the deep, healthy root system keeps it anchored to the earth.
So it survives and eventually regrows.
Right. A tree with a rotting root system is uprooted entirely by that same wind. The external shock is just a test of a society's structural integrity.
So it's not that a healthy society exists in a peaceful vacuum free of threats. It's that a healthy society has the deep roots and the institutional flexibility to absorb the blow, process the new reality, and keep standing.
Which points us directly toward the source's ultimate solution for longevity.
Which is?
Well, if the habits that lead to internal hollowing are learned culturally, and if complacency is just a neurological default that can be overridden, then resilience and survival can also be deliberately learned.
Okay, so if a society's structural integrity has been degraded by these bad habits, how do we rebuild it? What does the antidote actually look like in practice?
The sources argue forcefully for applying a scientific approach to societal management. We tend to measure a civilization's greatness by the size of its GDP, the lethality of its military, or the grandiosity of its architecture.
Yeah.
But the text suggests the true metric of longevity is simply how well a society learns and adapts.
So applying the scientific method to culture and governance.
Exactly. A resilient society must operate like a rigorous scientist. It must maintain the humility to constantly question its own hypotheses. It has to be eager to identify and correct its own mistakes.
Yeah.
And most importantly, it must actively update its laws, traditions, and institutions when better evidence presents itself. Science advances fundamentally because it embraces falsifiability and correction. Civilizations survive by adopting that exact same cognitive flexibility.
So the failure itself isn't the existential threat. The threat is the arrogant refusal to learn from the failure.
Yes. In fact, the text issues a very stark warning regarding hubris. The exact moment a society collectively decides it has achieved perfection, the moment it believes its systems are flawless and require no further iteration.
Its terminal decline has begun.
Right then and there.
Because if you genuinely believe you've built a utopia, there is no reason to expend the energy to adapt. You completely shut down the prefrontal cortex.
Exactly. And historically, various ideological frameworks and belief systems have inadvertently nurtured this dangerous illusion. When a society is promised eternal favor or told it possesses a divine, untouchable destiny, it creates a massive cultural blind spot.
Wow.
It breeds the illusion that the society is somehow magically exempt from the universal laws of cause and effect.
I can see that. It provides a profound, comforting, and entirely false sense of security.
And the historical record is just littered with the ruins of empires that believed they were exempt from consequence. Cause and effect eventually come for everyone.
Framing it through that lens is deeply revealing, especially when you look at how modern public debate operates. Today, admitting that a long-held policy failed or acknowledging that a societal assumption was just factually wrong is almost universally framed as a massive political or cultural weakness.
Oh, absolutely.
If a leader actually looks at new data and changes their mind, they are fiercely attacked for flip-flopping or lacking conviction. But what these sources are arguing is the exact inverse. Self-correction is not a symptom of weakness. It is the absolute, non-negotiable foundation of long-term survival.
The most formidable civilization is not the one that stubbornly claims it has never made an error. It is the one that possesses the courage to constantly audit its own foundation.
You know, it's incredibly easy to look backward at the Romans, the Greeks, or the Egyptians and dissect their hubris from the safety of a few thousand years. We can see exactly where they stopped adapting.
Of course.
But the real challenge, and really the whole point of deconstructing this, is applying this neurological and historical lens to our own lives right now. Look around at your own community, your own workplace, or even your own media diet.
Yeah, what small daily compromises are you witnessing?
Exactly. What cultural assumptions are we collectively accepting simply because it takes too much glucose, too much exhausting effort to stand up straight and challenge them?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Studying history is not merely an academic exercise in admiring ancient architecture or memorizing the dates of battles. It functions as a diagnostic tool for the present.
Right.
It trains us to recognize the invisible roots of decline, those quiet, creeping symptoms like rote memorization and ideological certainty, long before the storm actually hits the canopy. If we assume we are biologically identical to the citizens of those fallen empires, the time to start fiercely auditing our own root system is today.
We have to force ourselves to do the neurologically expensive work of paying attention. I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Building on that crucial point the sources made about the shift in education, we discussed the profound danger of an educational system that gives up on teaching inquiry and settles for demanding memorized answers. Well, if that is a primary symptom of a hollowing society, then perhaps the ultimate diagnostic test for the survival of our own civilization isn't the current size of our economy or the sophistication of our artificial intelligence. Perhaps the truest measure of how much time we really have left is simply the quality of the questions we are actively teaching the youngest generation to ask.